Hello everyone, this is Jed Schlackman. I'm a holistic counselor and energy healer. In this video I want to speak about some physical or physiological triggers and causes for psychological disturbances. And to put this in context, it's helpful to consider that we're really all beings that have our physical body, our mind and our emotions, and also our spiritual source, our soul, our spirit, whatever you might label it. So mind, body, spirit. And those are all part of a unified or integrated system. And what's happening in one aspect of our being has an effect on the other aspects or levels. And we want to consider all of these levels as we seek to support our health and well-being. It's common in the healthcare field for people to focus on one layer or another and to neglect the other levels or layers of the system. If someone is a psychotherapist, they might focus a lot on thoughts, on emotions, on the mental and psychological aspects, and they might not pay adequate attention sometimes to what's going on with a person's physiology, what their physical lifestyle is like, what their nutrition is like, what stresses and toxins they might be getting exposed to in the environment, those kinds of things. Now, physical doctors, regular MDs or DOs, and also psychiatrists who are working with people that have some psychological concerns, they will often consider the physical level, but perhaps only in terms of what they're offering as a treatment. So in many cases, a doctor will see you have a diagnosis for a psychiatric condition, and they'll prescribe a medication, and that medication, of course, is meant to influence the activity of particular chemicals in your brain or your nervous system. And that's sort of a short-term way to address symptoms. It's not actually looking at all the different factors that might be creating or causing some form of state of imbalance. It's not that the so-called chemical imbalance is the actual cause of your psychological disturbance. It's just something that may appear that has some correlation, but there are other things going on that are the actual causes. So they're treating kind of a mid-level symptom of an issue rather than the actual causes, and that's why it doesn't really get resolved and why people seem to continue needing to stay on a medication or something like that. It's because the actual causes, things that are creating that whole pattern, are really not being addressed. So now looking at this system where our psychology, our thoughts and emotions influence the body and vice versa, we're considering what things are happening on a physical level that could create a state of psychological distress, something such as anxiety or depression. So let's go through a list of some common physiological or physical level triggers and causes for psychological disturbance. First, we're going to consider what I'll call malnutrition. And the word malnutrition, it really just means bad nutrition or inadequate nutrition. So those who are familiar with an image of what malnutrition looks like, you'll often be thinking of someone in an impoverished country where they're hardly getting any food. You might see the pictures on television of children with their stomach distended because they have a severe form of malnutrition. However, there are many degrees, in a sense, of poor nutrition, many different ways that could occur or manifest. It's not always that visible or extreme. So if you're consuming too many processed foods and not getting enough nutrients, that is a form of malnutrition, and it's actually more common than many people imagine, and it can occur with people who are actually eating a lot of food. They're consuming plenty, but their diet, for whatever reason, isn't providing enough of the nutrients they need, or it's creating disturbances in their digestive system. So even though they are eating what looks like a healthy, balanced diet, they're actually not digesting or assimilating, you could say, absorbing enough of certain nutrients they need. And that has a ripple effect that affects their nervous system, their hormones, their neurotransmitters, and so on. So that's a complex matter to really assess, to see what's happening nutritionally with a person, but it's valuable to consider that aspect of mental health. And there are many studies that are done looking at how different nutrients, how different things we consume affect our symptoms, affect our state of consciousness, in a sense, our emotions, our behavior, and so on. So food and nutrition do play a significant role in our mental health. They are not always necessarily a cause or the primary cause of a particular pattern or diagnosis, but if there is another cause, the nutrition component could still play a role in how severe or how minimal that particular condition manifests. Another concern that could happen on a physical level to impact psychological disturbances would be brain injury. And our brain, of course, is part of the nervous system, the communication system of our body, how we perceive our environment, and how we respond and react to the environment. In general, different parts or areas of the brain are activated by different emotional and mental states. However, if you do something that influences the brain directly on a physical level, you can trigger different emotional and mental states, or enhance or suppress different mental and emotional states through what you're doing to the actual brain. And that could happen with a brain injury, where there's a certain part of the brain that's been damaged in some manner and isn't able to activate or function the way it originally did. Since our consciousness kind of maps out how it's interacting through the brain, if you've gone through your life having a certain part of the brain reflect a certain emotional state or mental state, and now that part of the brain isn't functioning, you might not be able to initially or even in the long term adapt and enable other parts of your brain to play the same function to compensate. So often people with brain injuries do display some type of psychological disturbance as an after effect of that injury. Now, there is the possibility for healing, for recovery and repair, and often that does take some prolonged amount of time to recover, but it's not a deterministic situation where only or just because you've had a brain injury for the rest of your life you're going to have a psychological disturbance from it. Things can repair themselves. There is the neuroplasticity of the brain, where it's continuing to reprogram and rewire things, and you can recover. So we'll go forward now to the next physical level factor that may trigger some form of psychological disturbance, and this is the psychoactive drugs, and that includes different recreational drugs, prescribed medical drugs. It could also include what people refer to as plant medicines or psychedelics. So all of those have an effect on the brain and the nervous system. And depending on the person, when that particular substance is used, the effects could be either short-term or persistent. So in many people, they'll use a certain substance and temporarily it shifts them into a certain mental or emotional state. And then after that wears off, they go back into their normal pattern of neurological activity, their normal pattern of psychological functioning. However, sometimes there are people who even through brief or short-term use of something get triggered into being stuck in a sense in an out-of-balance state where their pattern of functioning that they had prior to that doesn't return. They don't go back into their normal routine. They're somehow lastingly impacted by having used those substances. And of course, this happens even more often to people when they're chronically using some form of psychoactive substance. So with chronic use, continual use of something, it tends to create or generate, in a sense, an imbalanced pattern of activity in your nervous system, since your nervous system has compensated in some way for that substance which wouldn't normally be present or be active in our nervous system. So there is a risk there of triggering psychological disturbances with psychoactive substances. The next item in our list here is sleep disruption or sleep disturbances. So our sleep is part of our circadian rhythm, our normal biological patterns, and our daily cycle of states of consciousness. So there's a time of the day where normally we're sleeping, where our consciousness is not focused externally. We're not using what you could call the conscious alert part of the mind. That part is rested, that part of the brain in a sense is relaxed, and another aspect of our consciousness and our brain are being used. So we are processing things, we're dreaming, that's a significant activity, and that's something that's important for our overall health and well-being. So if we're cutting short those sleep cycles, if we're not getting the amount that we need for our regular functioning, different types of psychological symptoms can start to manifest, and you'll commonly find people who exhibit some form of anxiety, some form of depression, and even some form of psychotic symptoms when they're not getting much sleep. So their nervous system is kind of getting drained. It's getting out of balance because they're not in that normal cycle of chemistry that occurs when we do sleep. So this is something to be aware of, and kind of the catch-22 is that when you have those types of psychological states such as depression or anxiety, those in themselves can interfere or disrupt your pattern of sleep. So when you're anxious and tense and nervous and your mind is racing, it is hard to relax and get sleep. So it's kind of a vicious cycle sometimes, and it's hard to tell where it began. Did it start with something that disrupted your sleep, or did it start with the anxiety or whatever psychological state was occurring, which in turn disrupted the sleep. And next we have the concern of environmental toxins. Now, there's many different types of toxic things we're exposed to in our daily lives, and they could affect different people in different ways, but many of them do have potential effects on our nervous system and our psychological functioning. So if your brain is accumulating, let's say, heavy metals, those can disrupt the communication in the nervous system. They could actually make it hard to concentrate, hard to relax, hard to maintain a positive mood. There's many different things that could happen when they're disrupting the signaling in your nervous system. There's a lot of air pollution, there's a lot of pollution in water, in food. So these biochemical stresses can have an impact that can affect our psychological functioning, that can make it harder for the brain to integratively function, in a sense, for the different parts of the brain to communicate with one another, or for certain parts of the brain to either elevate or suppress their activity. So sometimes you could say the brain is kind of inflamed or overactivated. That could be a result of toxins that are part of your environment. And then sometimes there are parts of the brain that are suppressed. They're not able to activate or function adequately. And so that could limit your functioning also. Another physical level issue that affects our psychological state that could lead towards psychological disturbances is lack of exercise. We are physical beings. We have these animal bodies that are designed for physical activity and movement. So if you're not getting much physical activity or movement, things start to become stagnant, and you also will tend to be kind of deficient in some chemicals in your body, and you could build up an excess of other chemicals in your body. So those neurotransmitters and hormones that are affected by physical exercise also play a role in our psychological state. Many people naturally find that their mood improves when they exercise, and that's due in part to the fact that the exercise is stimulating the production of certain chemicals in the body. So consider your level of physical activity and how that might be affecting your psychological health. Another physiological factor or element is the amount of sunlight that we're exposed to. In our modern society, we're often spending pretty much all day indoors and perhaps not getting any sunlight at all. Sunlight provides a full spectrum of light, of frequencies and energies, which our bodies are naturally attuned to use for our health and well-being. So if we're only getting a limited part of the light spectrum through the lighting that's indoors, especially now with the fluorescent and LED lighting, people are not getting really the natural spectrum of light, and that could have a harmful effect on our psychological functioning. It is affecting our nervous system. It's affecting our well-being. Sunlight is also critical for certain hormones in our body. We need it, of course, for vitamin D, and sunlight helps trigger our body to create its own vitamin D. Sunlight is also related to melatonin. So if we're getting some sunlight during the day, that helps our body produce the melatonin, so it'll have it to help us sleep at night. So it's a circadian cycle, and it could be disrupted if we're not really getting adequate sunlight. Melatonin also has a connection or relationship with serotonin. So at nighttime, our body is creating the melatonin for sleep, but the same tryptophan and other elements are used to create the neurotransmitter serotonin, which is considered the mood-boosting neurotransmitter, and that would be more active during the daytime. So if we're not getting sunlight, it's probably affecting both of those, serotonin and melatonin. So that's something that affects many people's psychological health and well-being. There's a disorder that's called seasonal affective disorder, which is people feeling depressed during the winter time because they're not getting sunlight. So there's a pretty direct physiological causal factor contributing to a mood disturbance. And now the last item on the list we'll be covering here is EM pollution. That stands for electromagnetic pollution. And those are the electromagnetic frequencies that are in our environment that affect our physical body, and in terms of our psychological health, they're having some impact that disturbs the way we're feeling or thinking or behaving. So electromagnetic fields do have direct effects on physiology, especially if you're very acutely exposed to them. So if you have your mobile phone near your body a lot, if you're sitting at your desk right next to a Wi-Fi router, those kinds of things, those will often disturb our nervous system. And the more the exposure, the more it will start to deplete our neurotransmitters, interfere with biochemical pathways in the body, and it can lead to a variety of psychological disturbances. And in many cases, there really isn't a coexisting psychological stress or cause for those particular issues. There are particular cases where it's pretty much entirely triggered by what you're being exposed to at the physiological level. So in those cases, if you remove these causes, if you address those physical triggers and bring the person into a state where those factors are no longer disrupting their physiological functioning, you'll find that their psychological functioning comes back toward a balance or equilibrium. So whether you're working as a healthcare professional or you're just a lay person looking into how you can improve your own physical and psychological health, these are all factors that are really valuable to look at. Considering these in addition to how you're dealing with psychological concerns in your life, your relationships, your thought patterns, your skills for managing or processing emotions, these all together can be very powerful in bringing about well-being and helping people recover from different psychological challenges. I appreciate each of you for taking your time to view this presentation. For those that are interested in holistic health and psychology and spirituality, you are invited to visit my website, phinsights.com. That's phinsights.com. I wish everyone a wonderful day, Namaste.